The Pentagon cannot account for trillions of dollars, not millions, not billions, trillions. Money authorized by Congress, money allocated through official channels, money spent across the most powerful military system ever built. And yet, when asked to account for it in full, the answer is incomplete. Records exist, but they don't always align. Systems track spending, but not always consistently. Audits are conducted, but they don't pass. Year after year, the same conclusion returns. Not fully auditable, not fully traceable, not fully understood. Now, for most people, that fact sits quietly in the background. A technical issue, a bureaucratic problem, something buried in financial reports that rarely make front page news. But what if that's not how we should be looking at it? What if this isn't just about accounting? What if it's about structure? Because in any system this large, with this much money moving through it, the question is not simply where the money goes. The question is what becomes possible when that money becomes difficult to follow. And if there are things that cannot be easily tracked, cannot be easily audited, cannot be easily explained, then there is space. Space for programs, space for operations, space for activities that exist without ever fully stepping into the light. So tonight, we're not starting with the sky. We're not starting with sightings. We're not starting with pilots or radar or unexplained craft. We're starting somewhere far more grounded. We are starting with the system that funds everything. Because if something exists at scale, if it operates over years or decades, if it involves personnel, infrastructure, materials, research, then it requires resources. And resources require funding. Which means somewhere there is a financial pathway. And if that pathway is hidden or fragmented or deliberately obscured, then the truth doesn't need to be denied. It only needs to be contained. Welcome back to UFO to UAP, the Disclosure Report. I am your host, Matt Tones. Thank you for joining in. Please subscribe. Today's episode is titled The UFO Black Budget, Where the Money Really Goes. And in this episode, we step into a part of the conversation that is rarely explored in detail, not because it is inaccessible, but because it is complex. And complexity has a way of discouraging attention. But if you want to understand why the question of UAP, of unidentified aerial phenomena, remains unresolved, you have to look at the system that shaped what can be known, not just what is seen, but what is recorded, what is shared, what is allowed to move from one level of awareness to another. Because information does not move freely inside large institutions. It moves through channels, controlled channels, and those channels are built, funded, and maintained through structures that are not always visible from the outside. So before we talk about what is in the sky, we need to understand what is happening on the ground, specifically how the largest defense organization in the world manages its money. The United States Department of Defense operates on a scale that is really difficult to fully comprehend. Each year, its budget reaches into the hundreds of billions of dollars. That funding supports everything from personnel and operations to research and development to global logistics and infrastructure. It is a system that spans continents, a system that operates across air, land, sea, space, and now increasingly cyber domains. It is vast, and because it is vast, it is also complex. But complexity alone does not explain what has happened over the past several years, because since 2018, the Department of Defense has been required to undergo full financial audits, independent audits, designed to assess whether spending can be properly tracked, verified, and accounted for. And every year since then, the result has been the same. The Department of Defense has not passed a full audit, not once. Now, it's important to be precise here. This does not mean that the money is missing in the way people often imagine. It does not mean that trillions of dollars have simply vanished without a trace. What it means is more technical and at the same time, more revealing. It means that the systems used to track and verify spending are not fully integrated, not fully aligned, and in some cases, not fully capable of providing a complete coherent picture. Different branches use different systems. Different programs report in different ways. Legacy infrastructure interacts with newer digital frameworks. And the result is a financial environment where clarity is not always achievable, even internally. And think about that for a moment. An organization with access to the most advanced technology in the world struggles to produce a fully unified account of how its money is spent. Now, again, there are explanations for this. Scale is one of them, history is another. Some of these systems were built decades ago, expanded over time, layered on top of each other, evolved in response to changing threats, changing technologies, changing priorities. So, yes, complexity is real, but complexity also has a consequence. Because when systems become difficult to navigate, they also become difficult to oversee. And when oversight becomes difficult, it creates conditions where certain activities can operate with less visibility. Not necessarily because someone is trying to hide them, but because the structure itself allows for it. At this point, it's important to slow down because there is a tendency when discussing large opaque systems to jump to conclusions, to assume intent, to assume design, to assume that every gap, every inconsistency is part of a deliberate plan. But that's not how systems usually work. Most large systems are not built in a single moment. They evolve, they adapt, they accumulate layers over time. And sometimes those layers create unintended effects. But whether those effects are intentional or not, the outcome is the same: reduced visibility, limited transparency, fragmented understanding. And within that environment, the line between what is known and what is not fully known becomes harder to define. Now, consider this in the context of national security, because defense systems are not designed for openness, they're designed for control: control of information, control of access, control of capability. Certain details must remain restricted. Certain programs must remain classified. That is not unusual, that is standard practice. But when you combine classification with complexity, something interesting begins to happen. Information doesn't just become hidden, it becomes compartmentalized, divided into segments, distributed across different parts of the system, accessible only to those who have both the clearance and the specifics to know. And that phrase, need to know, is central to everything that follows because it defines how information moves, not freely, not openly, but selectively. You don't access information because you're authorized in general. You access information because your role requires it in that specific moment, which means that even individuals working within the same organization may not see the same picture. They may not have access to the same data. They may not even know that certain programs exist. And when that level of compartmentalization is combined with funding structures that are difficult to trace, you begin to see how a system can operate with layers that are not fully visible, even from the inside. So now we return to the central question of this episode: not are UFOs real, not what are UAPs, but something more foundational. If programs existed focused on advanced aerospace phenomena or technologies not publicly acknowledged, where would they be? How would they be structured? And most importantly, how would they be funded? Because no matter how secret a program is, It cannot function without resources. It cannot operate without people, materials, infrastructure. And all those things require money. So the question becomes, what kind of financial system allows for programs to exist without being easily visible? And the answer begins with something known as the black budget. The term black budget refers to funding allocated to classified programs that are not disclosed in detail to the public, in some cases, not disclosed at all. This is not speculation. This is a recognized part of government spending. Each year, a portion of the defense and intelligence budget is designated for activities that require secrecy. And again, this is not unusual. Every major nation does this. It is considered necessary for national security. But the black budget is not a single unified pool of money. It is a collection of allocations distributed across different agencies, different programs, different priorities. Some of it is acknowledged at a high level. Figures may be released in aggregate. Broad categories may be described, but the details, the specifics, remain classified. And within that structure, there are further layers. Programs that are known to exist, but not fully described. Programs that are restricted, but still tracked. And then programs that are so tightly controlled that their existence is not openly confirmed. And this is where the conversation begins to move beyond standard classification and into something more structured, more deliberate, more contained. Because at this level, it is no longer just about keeping information secret. It's about controlling who even knows that the information exists. And that distinction is where the system changes. We'll go deeper into that structure in the next part, but for now, hold on to this idea because it reframes everything. If a system is designed in such a way that not all information is visible, not all programs are acknowledged, and not all funding is easily traceable, then the absence of evidence is no longer a simple mystery. It becomes an expected outcome, not because nothing is there, but because the system itself is not built to reveal it. And if that's true, then the question we've been asking for decades may not be the right one. Not where is the proof, but what kind of system ensures that proof never reaches you? If you follow the money, you eventually reach a point where the trail begins to fade, not because it ends, but because it changes form. Numbers become categories, categories become classifications, and classifications become barriers. Barriers that are not easily crossed, not by the public, not by journalists, and in some cases, not even by those working inside the system itself. Because once funding moves into what is broadly referred to as the black budget, it enters a different environment, an environment governed by a different set of rules. To understand that environment, we need to step back because the idea of a black budget did not appear overnight. It evolved slowly in response to pressure, in response to conflict, in response to a simple reoccurring reality. Nations require capabilities that cannot always be discussed openly. During the Cold War, this reality accelerated rapidly. Technological competition between global powers created an urgency to develop systems that would provide strategic advantage. Stealth technology, signals intelligence, early satellite systems, advanced propulsion concepts. None of these could be developed entirely in the open. And so funding pathways were created, pathways that allowed governments to invest in sensitive capabilities without exposing those capabilities to adversaries. This is where the architecture begins, not as a hidden conspiracy, but as a strategic necessity, at least initially. Over time, these funding mechanisms became more refined, more structured, more embedded within the broader defense system. Budgets were divided, line items were obscured, descriptions were generalized, and oversight, while present, became increasingly specialized. Certain committees were granted access, certain individuals were briefed, but access was never universal. It was always controlled, always limited, always based on that central principle: need to know. Now, at a surface level, the black budget is still part of the official budget. It is approved, allocated, distributed, but the detail is restricted, which means that while the total figure may be known in broad terms, the internal breakdown is not. And that's where complexity begins to work in a different way. Because when funding is aggregated and then distributed across multiple layers, it becomes difficult to reconstruct the original pathway, even with access, even with clearance, because what you are seeing is not the future structure, sorry, not the full structure. You are seeing your part of it, your segment, your compartment, and nothing beyond that. Imagine a system where one program is funded through multiple channels. Each channel appears unrelated. Each allocation is small enough to avoid attention. Each report is isolated from the others. Individually, nothing stands out, but collectively, they support something much larger, something that only becomes visible if you can see across all compartments at once. And in systems like this, very few people can. This is not hypothetical. This is how compartmentalized funding structures are designed to operate, not to confuse, but to protect, at least in theory. Because from a security perspective, it makes sense. If sensitive programs were funded through a single, clearly identifiable stream, they would be easier to detect, easier to analyze, easier to target. But by distributing funding, by fragmenting the pathway, you reduce that risk. You make it harder for adversaries to understand what is being developed, where it is being developed, and how far that development is. Sorry, how far along that development is. But there is a consequence to this approach, because the same mechanisms that protect programs from external visibility also reduce internal transparency. And when transparency is reduced, oversight becomes more complex. Not impossible, but more difficult, more dependent on trust, more dependent on selective access. Now, at this stage, it's important to remain grounded because none of this automatically implies wrongdoing. Black budgets exist for legitimate reasons. They support operations that cannot be publicly disclosed. They protect capabilities that would be compromised if revealed. And in many cases, they are essential to national security. But systems do not exist in isolation. They interact, they evolve, they expand, and sometimes they extend beyond their original intent. Because once a structure is in place, once a mechanism exists, it can be used in ways that were not originally anticipated. Funding pathways that were designed for specific programs can be adapted, expanded, rerouted, and over time, the distinction between different categories of spending can become less clear, especially when those categories are not fully visible. So the question becomes, at what point does a system designed for secrecy becomes a system that enables concealment, and is there a difference? Because secrecy implies protection, concealment implies restriction, and the line between those two ideas is not always easy to define. Now, consider this in context of scale, because we are not talking about small amounts of money. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars moving through a system that is already complex, already layered, already difficult to fully audit. And within that system, a portion is designated as classified, a portion is restricted, a portion is not openly described, which means that even if the majority of spending is transparent, there is always a segment that is not, a segment that operates under different rules, different expectations, different levels of visibility. And within that segment, there are further distinctions. Some programs are classified but widely understood within the appropriate circles. Others are restricted but still subject to formal oversight. And then there are programs that exist at the edge of the system, programs that are so tightly controlled that access is extremely limited, information is fragmented, and awareness is not widespread. These programs are often associated with what are known as special access programs, and we'll explore those in detail in the next part. But for now, focus on the financial structure because funding is the foundation. Without it, nothing else exists. If a program requires personnel, it needs salaries. If it requires facilities, it needs infrastructure. If it requires research, it needs resources. All of these things are tangible. All of them require support. All of them must be paid for, which means that even the most secret program leaves a footprint, not necessarily a visible one, but a trace, a pattern, a set of financial movements that, if viewed in isolation, appear ordinary, but when viewed together, suggest something more. Now, here's where the conversation begins to intersect with the broader UAP discussion, because for years, one of the central questions has been if advanced technologies exist, if unconventional craft have been observed, if there are programs investigating these phenomena, where are they? Why are they not visible? Why is there no clear, unified disclosure? And one possible answer is that they are not located within the parts of the system that are designed to be visible. They are located within the parts that are designed to be controlled, funded through pathways that are fragmented, distributed across compartments, protected by layers of classification, and supported by a structure that does not easily reveal its full shape. Now, again, this is not a claim, this is a framework, a way of understanding how such a scenario could exist without requiring a single point of concealment, because large systems do not hide things in one place. They distribute them, they separate them, they ensure that no single failure, no single leak, no single oversight gap can expose the entire structure. So instead of asking, why is there no single piece of definitive proof? We begin to ask, what kind of system would produce many small fragments, but no complete picture? What kind of funding structure would allow for sustained activity without a clear, traceable line? What kind of architecture would support long-term programs without making them fully visible? And as we move forward, we begin to see the answer is not simple. It is not a single mechanism. It is a combination of structures, financial, operational, organizational, all working together to manage not just what is known, but how it is known. Because in systems like this, information is not just stored, it is shaped, directed, contained, and sometimes kept just out of reach. In the next part, we go deeper, beyond the funding itself, into the structure that governs access, the system that determines who sees what and when. Because if the black budget provides the resources, then special access programs provide the framework, the rules, the boundaries, the architecture of secrecy itself. And once you understand that architecture, the absence of clear answers begins to make a different kind of sense. If the black budget is the fuel, then special access programs are the engine. They are the structure that determines how information is handled, how access is granted, and how entire areas of activity can exist without being widely understood. Because funding alone does not create secrecy. Structure does, rules do, boundaries do, and special access program known as SAPs are built around those boundaries. At a basic level, a special access program is exactly what the name suggests, a program that requires special access beyond standard classification. Now, in most systems, classification already exists. Information is labeled, restricted, protected according to its sensitivity: confidential, secret, top secret. Each level defines who can access the information and under what conditions. But SAPs go further. They introduce an additional layer, an additional barrier. And if you have the highest level of clearance, but you do not automatically gain access to an SAP, because access is not determined solely by clearance, it is determined by special inclusion or specific inclusion. You are either read into the program or you are not. This creates a fundamentally different environment because now information is not just restricted by level, it is restricted by membership. You can be inside the system and still be outside the program. You can hold senior positions and still have no visibility into certain activities. And that changes how knowledge exists within the organization. It becomes segmented, distributed, isolated. Imagine a system where knowledge is divided into counterparts or compartments. Each compartment contains a portion of the overall picture. Each compartment is sealed, and movement between compartments is tightly controlled. Now imagine that very few people, if any, have access to all compartments at once. What you have then is not a single unified understanding, but a series of partial understandings, each accurate within its own boundary, but incomplete in the larger context. This is the architecture of compartmentalization, and it is not accidental, it is designed, because from a security perspective, it reduces risk. If one compartment is exposed, the others remain protected. If one individual leaks information, they can only leak what they know, and what they know is limited. Now, within special access programs, there are different categories. Some are acknowledged, meaning that their existence is known, even if the details are not. Others are unacknowledged, meaning that even their existence is not officially confirmed. And this is where the structure becomes more complex, because in an unacknowledged special access program, there is no clear public reference point, no official listing, no direct acknowledgement, access is tightly controlled, information is minimal, and awareness is extremely limited. In these environments, even identifying the program can be difficult. Names may be coded, descriptions may be vague, funding may be distributed across multiple channels, and personnel may only be aware of their specific function, not the broader purpose. Now, again, this is not speculation. This is how highly sensitive programs are structured. The goal is not just to keep information secret, the goal is to ensure that only those who absolutely need to know have access to it, and even then, only the portion they require. But there is a consequence of this level of control, because when information is divided this way, it becomes difficult to reconstruct the full picture, not just from the outside, but from within. Oversight becomes fragmented, understanding becomes partial, and coordination requires a level of integration that is not always present. So now we return to the broader question. If there were programs focused on UAPs, on unidentified aerial phenomena, on advanced technologies that are not publicly acknowledged, where would they exist? Not in open systems, not in easily accessible reports, not in structures designed for visibility. They would exist here, within compartmentalized environments, within restricted access programs, within systems designed to limit awareness. Because that is the only place where such programs could operate without generating a clear, unified trail, without producing a single point of reference, without creating evidence that is easily assembled into a complete narrative. Now, consider how this interacts with funding, because in the next part we explore how, I'm sorry, in the previous part we explored how black budget allocations can be fragmented, distributed across multiple channels, obscured within broader categories. When that funding enters a special access program environment, it is no longer just about where the money goes. It is about who can see it, who can connect it, who can interpret it. You might have one team working on materials analysis, another working on a propulsion concepts, another handling data collection, each funded through separate allocations, each operating within its own compartment, each unaware of how their work fits into the larger system. Individually, nothing appears unusual, but collectively, they may be contributing to something far more significant, something that only becomes visible if you can see across compartments. And in systems like this, very few people can. Now, this is where the concept of oversight becomes critical, because in theory, there are mechanisms in place to ensure that even highly classified programs are monitored. Select members of Congress, specialized committees, internal review structures, all designed to provide accountability, but in practice, oversight is only as effective as access, and access is controlled. If a program is unacknowledged, if its existence is not widely disclosed, then oversight becomes limited to those who are aware of it. And if awareness is restricted, then oversight is inherently constrained, not necessarily eliminated, but narrowed, focused, depended on a small number of individuals. This creates a system where control is concentrated, where knowledge is segmented, where the full picture is not easily assembled. Now, again, it is important to remain precise. This does not mean that there is no oversight. It means that oversight operates within the same structure as everything else: compartmentalized, restricted, distributed. And that brings us to a critical point. Because when people ask, why hasn't this been revealed? Why hasn't someone come forward with definitive proof? They are often imagining a system that is unified, a system where information is centralized, where a single leak could expose everything. But that is not how these systems are designed. They are designed to prevent exactly that. No single individual has complete access. No single document contains the full picture. No single pathway leads directly from the source to the public domain. Instead, information exists in fragments, pieces, segments, each one real, each one valid, but none of them sufficient on their own to provide a complete understanding. So when fragments do emerge, when pilots report encounters, when radar data is released, when whistleblowers describe specific elements, they often appear disconnected, inconclusive, incomplete. And that is not necessarily because the underlying reality is unclear. It may be because the system that contains that reality is structured to prevent clarity from forming. This is the difference between a lack of evidence and a lack of assembled evidence, because the pieces may exist, but if they are separated, if they are distributed, if they are contained within different compartments, then assembling them becomes extremely difficult. Now, as we move into the next part, we begin to connect this structure directly to the UAP discussion, because this is where whistleblower testimony, public statements, and emerging patterns start to align with the architecture we've just explored. If programs exist within these systems, if they are funded through fragmented pathways, if they are contained within restricted access environments, then the absence of a clear unified disclosure is no longer surprising. It becomes a function of the system itself. And that leads us to the next question: not just how the system works, but who has seen it from the inside, who has operated within these compartments, who has had access to even a portion of the picture, and what they are now saying about it. Because once individuals begin to step forward, even with limited information, patterns begin to emerge. And those patterns may tell us more about the system than any single piece of evidence ever could. By now, the outline of the system is clear: funding that becomes difficult to trace, programs that are not easily visible, information that is not widely shared, and structures that are designed not just to protect what is known, but to control who can know it. So the next step is not theoretical, it's practical. If such a system exists, and if it operates in the way we've described, then we can begin to ask a more grounded question. Where would UAP-related programs logically sit within it? Not based on speculation, but based on structure. Because whatever UAP represents, whatever is being observed, whatever has been reported by military personnel, pilots, and intelligence officials, if there are sustained efforts to study it, to understand it, to engage with it in any structured way, then those efforts must exist somewhere. They must be organized, they must be resourced, they must be funded, and they must be contained within a framework that allows them to operate. Now, let's apply what we know. Would such programs exist in publicly accessible systems? Unlikely. Would they sit within standard reporting channels? Also unlikely. Would they be widely visible across multiple branches of government? Again, unlikely. Because the nature of the phenomenon itself, whatever it may be, introduces uncertainty. And uncertainty at that level, combined with potential strategic implications, would almost certainly trigger the highest levels of classification, which means that if a program exists, they would not sit at the surface. They would sit within the deepest layers of the system, within compartmentalized environments, within special access programs, potentially with unacknowledged programs funded through pathways that do not draw attention, structured in a way that limits exposure. Now, this is not a claim, it is a logical placement, a structural alignment. Given everything we've explored, this is where such programs would exist if they exist at all. And this is where whistleblower testimony becomes relevant, not as confirmation, but as a point of comparison. Because when individuals who have operated within intelligence or defense environments begin to describe similar structures, similar limitations, similar patterns of access, we can start to assess how those descriptions align with what we know about the system. One of the most prominent figures in recent discussions is David Grusch, a former intelligence official who stated publicly that he was informed of programs related to the recovery and analysis of non-human technology. Now, it is crucial or critical to remain precise here. These claims are not verified in the public domain. They have not been confirmed through official disclosure, and they should be treated as claims, not established fact. But what is significant is not just what is being claimed, it's how those claims describe the structure. Because according to Grusch, the programs he became aware of were not easily accessible. They were not openly acknowledged. They were compartmentalized, restricted, difficult to penetrate, which aligns closely with the architecture we've just explored. No proof, but consistency. And this is not limited to a single individual. Over time, other voices have emerged: former officials, military personnel, individuals who describe encountering barriers to access, limitations in visibility, a sense that certain information exists, but it is not widely available. And again, none of this confirms the existence of any specific program, but it doesn't but it does reinforce a pattern that matches the structure of highly compartmentalized systems. Now, let's consider the implications, because if programs were structured in this way, if they were funded through the fragmented black budget pathways, if they were contained within restricted access environments, then several things would follow naturally. First, information would not be centralized. There would be no single database, no single repository, no single point where everything is stored. Instead, data would be distributed across compartments, across teams, across systems. Second, access would be limited. Even individuals with high clearance would not automatically see the full picture. They would see their part, their segment, their responsibility, and nothing beyond that. Third, oversight would be constrained, not absent, but restricted, dependent on who is aware of the program and who has been granted access, which means that even within government, understanding would be uneven, partial, fragmented. And fourth, public disclosure would be extremely difficult, not because someone is actively blocking it at every step, but because the system itself does not produce a complete, unified narrative. There is no single document to release, no single briefing that contains everything, no single individual who can speak with full authority on the entire structure. So when people ask, why hasn't this been disclosed? Why is there no clear answer? Why do we only see fragments? The answer may not be a single decision. It may be the outcome of the system itself. Because in a system like this, clarity is not the default, fragmentation is. Now let's take this one step further because up to this point, we've focused on structure, on funding, on access, on containment. But there is another layer, a deeper implication, one that goes beyond the mechanics of the system and into the question of control. Because if information is structured this way, if access is limited, if awareness is restricted, then control becomes concentrated, not necessarily in a single place, not necessarily in a single group, but within a relatively small number of compartments, a relatively small number of individuals who have no visibility into specific areas that others do not. And this creates an asymmetry between what is known internally and what is known or what is visible externally, between what is accessible within certain compartments and what is available to the public. Now, again, we need to remain grounded because this does not automatically imply intent. It does not prove that information is being deliberately withheld for any specific reason, but it does highlight a structural reality. In systems like this, control of information is not evenly distributed. It is managed, directed, contained. And when that structure intersects with a phenomenon that is not fully understood, the result is not clarity, it is continued uncertainty. Because even if parts of the system are attempting to understand the phenomenon, those parts may not be connected. They may not share information freely. They may not even be aware of each other, which means that progress, if it is happening, is not necessarily visible, not necessarily unified, not necessarily moving toward a single conclusion. So instead of imagining a system where everything is known behind closed doors, we might consider a different possibility, a system where knowledge is distributed, fragmented, partially understood, even internally. And in that kind of system, the absence of a clear answer is not surprising, but is expected. Now, as we reach the end of this episode, we return to the question that has been sitting beneath everything we've discussed. If a system exists that is capable of funding programs without clear visibility, that is capable of structuring access in a highly restricted way, that is capable of distributing information across compartments, then what does that mean for the question of UAPs? It means that the lack of a definitive answer does not necessarily reflect a lack of activity. It may reflect the nature of the system itself. A system where information is segmented, access is controlled, funding is fragmented, and visibility is limited. So next time the question is asked, where is the proof? It may be worth asking a different question instead. What kind of system would ensure that even if the proof exists, it does not appear in one place in one form at one time? Because if such a system exists, then the absence of a single clear answer is no longer the mystery. The system is. This has been UFO to UAP, the disclosure report. And in the next episode, we go further inside the structure itself, beyond funding, beyond placement, into the internal mechanisms of programs that may not officially exist, unacknowledged, restricted, and operating beyond conventional oversight.